Old Mrs. Chundle by Thomas Hardy, a short story written in about 1889, but published posthumously some 40 years later. The curate had not been a week in the parish, but the autumn morning proving fine, he thought he would make a little watercolour sketch, showing a distant view of the Corvsgate ruin 2 miles off, which he had passed on his way hither. The sketch occupied him a longer time than he had anticipated. The luncheon hour drew on, and he felt hungry. Quite near him was a stone-built old cottage of respectable and substantial build. He entered it, and was received by an old woman. "Can you give me something to eat, my good woman?" he said. She held her hand to her ear. "Can you give me something for lunch?" he shouted. "Bread and cheese, anything will do." A sour look crossed her face, and she shook her head. "Oh, that's unlucky," murmured he. She reflected, and said more urbanely, "Well, I'm going to have my own bit of dinner in no such long time hence. 'Tis taters and cabbage, boiled wi' a scantling of bacon. Would you like it? But I suppose 'tis the wrong sort, and that you would sooner have bread and cheese." "No, I'll join you. Call me when 'tis ready, I'm just out here." "Aye, I've seen you. Drawing the old stones, bain't ye? Sure, 'tis well some folk had nothing better to do with their time. Very well, I'll call you when I've dished up." He went out and resumed his painting, till in about 7 or 10 minutes the old woman appeared at her door and held up her hand. The curate washed his brush, went to the brook, rinsed his hands, and proceeded to the house. "There's yours," she said, pointing to the table. "I'll have my bit here," and denoted the settle. "Why not join me?" "Oh, faith, I don't want to eat with my betters, not I." And she continued firm in her resolution, and ate apart. The vegetables had been well cooked over a wood fire, the only way to cook a vegetable properly, and the bacon was well boiled. The curate ate heartily. He thought he had never tasted such potatoes and cabbage in his life, which he probably had not, for they had just been brought in from the garden, so that the very freshness of the morning was still in them. When he had finished, he asked her how much he owed for the repast, which he had much enjoyed. "Oh, I don't want to be paid for a bit of snack, I believe." "But really, you must take something. It was an excellent meal." "Ah, it is all my own growing, that's true. But I don't take money for a bit of victuals. I'd never done such a thing in my life." "I should feel much happier if you would." She seemed unsettled by his feeling, and added, as by compulsion, "Well then, I suppose twopence won't hurt ye?" "Twopence?" "Yes, twopence." "Why, my good woman, that's no charge at all. I'm sure it is worth this at least." And he laid down a shilling. "I tell you 'tis twopence and no more," she said firmly. He thereupon argued no further, paid the limited sum demanded, and went to the door. "And where does that road lead?" he asked, by way of engaging her in a little friendly conversation before parting, and pointing to a white lane which branched from the direct highway near her door. "Oh, they tell me it leads to Entworth." "And how far is Entworth?" "Oh, 3 mile, they say, but God knows if 'tis true." "You haven't lived here long, then?" 35 year come Martinmas." "And yet you've never been to Entworth?" "Not I. Why should I? I have never had any business there. Great mansion of a place, holding people I've no more doings with than the people of the moon. No, there's only 2 places I ever go from year's end to year's end. That's once a fortnight to Anglebury to do my bit of marketing, and once a week to my parish church." "And which is that?" "Why, Kingscreech." "Oh, then you are in my parish." "Maybe, just on the outskirts." "I didn't know the parish extended so far. I'm a newcomer. Well, I hope we may meet again. Good afternoon to you." When the curate was next talking to his rector, he casually observed, "By the way, that's a curious old soul who lives out towards Corvsgate, old Mrs. Oh, I don't know her name. A deaf old woman."
"Oh, you mean old Mrs. Chundle, I suppose?"
"Oh, she tells me she's lived there 35 years and has never been to Entworth. She only goes to the market town and to church on Sundays."
"To church on Sundays? She rather exaggerates her travels, to my thinking. I've been rector here 13 years, and I've certainly never seen her at church in my time."
"A wicked old woman! What can she think of herself as such deception?" On reflection, the curate felt that this was decidedly a case for his ministrations, and on his first spare morning he strode across to the cottage beyond the ruin. He found its occupant, of course, at home. "Drawing pictures again?" she asked, looking up from the hearth where she was scouring the fire dogs. "No, I come on more important matters, Mrs. Chundle. I'm the new curate of this parish.
Oh, you said you was last time. You find us a roguish lot, I make no doubt.
Well, I won't go into that, but I think it was a very culpable, unkind thing for you to tell me that you came to church every Sunday, when I find you've not been seen there for years.
Oh, did I tell you that?
You certainly did.
Oh, no, I wonder what I did that for.
I wonder too.
Well, you could have guessed after all that I didn't come to any service. Lord, what's the good of my lumpering all the way to church and back again when I was deaf as a block? Your own common sense ought to have told you that. 'Twas but a figure of speech, seeing as you was a parson.
Well, don't you think you could hear the service if you were to sit close to the reading desk and pulpit?
I'm sure I couldn't. Oh, no, not a word. Why, I couldn't hear anything, even at the time. Eyes at cards used to cry the amens out loud before anything that's done nowadays. And they had the barrel organ for the tunes. Years and years are gone. I was stronger in my nerves than now.
I'm sorry. There's one thing I could do, which I would with pleasure, if you'll use it. I could get you an ear trumpet. Will you use it?
Aye, sure, that I will. I don't care what I use, 'tis all the same to me.
And you'll come?
Yes, I may as well go there as bide here, I suppose.
The ear trumpet was purchased by the zealous young man, and the next Sunday, to the great surprise of the parishioners when they arrived, Mrs. Chundle was discovered in the front seat of the nave of Kingscreech Church, facing the rest of the congregation with an unmoved countenance. She was the centre of observation through the whole morning service. The trumpet, elevated at a high angle, shone and flashed in the sitter's eyes as the chief object in the sacred edifice. The curate could not speak to her that morning, and called the next day to inquire the result of the experiment. As soon as she saw him in the distance, she began shaking her head.
No, no, she said decisively as he approached. I know 'twas all nonsense.
What?
'Twasn't a morsel of good, and so I could have told 'ee before you're wasting your money and gimcracks upon an old ooman like me.
You couldn't hear? Dear me, how disappointing.
You might as well have been mouthing at me from the top of Creech Barrow.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
I shall never come no more, never, to be made such a fool of as that again.
The curate mused. I'll tell you what, Mrs. Chundle. There's one more thing to try, and only one. If this fails, I suppose we shall have to give it up. It is a plan I have heard of, though I've never seen it myself tried. It's having a sound tube fixed with the lower mouth in the seat immediately below the pulpit, with its upper end opening in a bell mouth just beside the bookboard. The voice of the preacher enters the bell mouth and is carried down directly to the listener's ear. Do you understand?
Exactly.
And you'll come if I put it up at my own expense.
I suppose I'll try it, even though I said I wouldn't. May as well do that as do nothing, I reckon.
The kind-hearted curate, at great trouble to himself, obtained the tube and had it fixed vertically as described, the upper mouth being immediately under the face of whoever should preach. And on the following Sunday morning it was to be tried. As soon as he came from the vestry, the curate perceived to his satisfaction Mrs. Chundle in the seat beneath, erect and at attention, her head close to the lower orifice of the soundpipe, and a look of great complacency that her soul required a special machinery to save it, while other people's could be saved in a commonplace way. The rector read the prayers from the desk on the opposite side, which part of the service Mrs. Chundle could follow easily enough by the help of the prayer book. And in due course, the curate mounted the 8 steps into the wooden octagon, gave out his text, and began to deliver his discourse. It was a fine frosty morning in early winter, and he had not got far with his sermon when he became conscious of a steam rising from the bell mouth of the tube, obviously caused by Mrs. Chundle's breathing at the lower end, and it was accompanied by a suggestion of onion stew. However, he preached on a while, hoping it would cease, holding in his left hand his finest cambric handkerchief, kept especially for Sunday morning services. At length, no longer able to endure the odour, he lightly dropped the handkerchief into the bell of the tube, without stopping the eloquent flow of his words, and he had the satisfaction of feeling himself in comparatively pure air. He heard a fidgeting below, and presently there arose to him over the pulpit edge a hoarse whisper. "The pipe's chocked!" Now, as you will perceive, my brethren, by applying this test to ourselves, our discernment of "the pipe's chocked," our discernment of actions as morally good or indifferent, will be much quickened, and we shall be materially helped in our... Suddenly there came a violent puff of warm wind, and he beheld his handkerchief rising from the bell of the tube and floating down to the pulpit floor. The little boys in the gallery laughed, thinking it a miracle. Mrs. Chundle had, in fact, applied her mouth to the bottom end and blown with all her might and cleared the tube. In a few seconds the atmosphere of the pulpit became as before, to the curate's great discomfiture. Yet stop the orifice again he dared not, lest the old woman should make a still greater disturbance and draw the attention of the congregation to this unseemly situation. "If you carefully analyse the passage I have quoted," he continued in somewhat uncomfortable accents, "you will perceive that it naturally suggests 3 points for consideration. It's not onions, it's peppermint," he said to himself. "Namely, mankind in its unregenerate state, and cider. The incidents of the law and loving kindness or grace which we now severally consider. And pickled cabbage, what a terrible supper she must have made, under the twofold aspect of external and internal consciousness." Thus the Reverend continued strenuously for perhaps 5 minutes longer. Then he could stand it no more. Desperately thrusting his thumb into the hole, he drew the threads of his distracted discourse together, the while hearing her blow vigorously to dislodge the plug, but he stuck to the hole and brought his sermon to a premature close. He did not call on Mrs. Chundle the next week, a slight cooling of his zeal for her spiritual welfare being manifest, but he encountered her at the house of another cottager, and she immediately addressed him as a partner in the same enterprise. "I could hear beautiful," she said. "Yes, every word. Never did I know such a wonderful machine as that there pipe. But you forgot what you was doing once or twice and put your handkerchief on the top of it and stopped the sound a bit. Please do not do that again, for it makes me lose a lot. Howsomever, I shall come every Sunday morning regular now, please God." The curate quivered internally. "And will you come to my house once in a while and read to me?" "Oh, of course." Surely enough, the next Sunday the ordeal was repeated for him. In the evening, he told his trouble to the rector, and the rector chuckled. "You've brought it upon yourself," he said. "You don't know this parish so well as I. You should have left the old woman alone." "I suppose I should." "Thank heaven, she thinks nothing of my sermons, and doesn't come when I preach." "Well," said the curate, somewhat ruffled, "I must do something. I cannot stand this. I shall tell her not to come." "You can hardly do that." "And I've half promised to go and read to her. But I shan't go." "Oh, she's probably forgotten by this time that you promised." A vision of his next Sunday in the pulpit loomed horridly before the young man, and at length he determined to escape the experience. The pipe should be taken down. The next morning he gave directions, and the removal was carried out. A day or two later, a message arrived from her saying that she wished to see him. Anticipating a terrific attack from the irate old woman, he put off going to her for a day, and when he trudged out towards her house on the following afternoon, it was in a vexed mood. "Thank heaven the tube is gone," he said to himself as he walked, "and nothing will make me put it up again." On coming near, he saw to his surprise that the calico curtains of the cottage windows were all drawn. He went up to the door, which was ajar, and a little girl peeped through the opening. "How is Mrs. Chundle?" he asked blandly. "She's dead, sir," said the little girl in a whisper. "Dead? Mrs. Chundle dead?" "Yes, sir." A woman now came. "Yes, 'tis so, sir. She went off quite sudden, like about 2 hours ago. Well, you see, sir, she was over 70 years of age, and last Sunday she was rather late in starting for church, but was very anxious to be on time, so she hurried over much and runned up the hill. It upset her heart, and she's been poorly all the week since, and that made her send for 'ee. 2 or 3 times she said she hoped you would come soon, as she promised to, and you were so staunch and faithful in wishing to do her good that she knew 'twas not by your own wish you didn't arrive. But she wouldn't let us send again, as it might trouble 'ee too much, and there might be other poor folks needing you. She worried to think she might not be able to listen to 'ee next Sunday, and feared you'd be hurt at it, and think her remiss. But she was eager to hear you again, later on. However, 'twas ordained otherwise for the poor soul, and she was soon gone. 'I've found a real friend at last,' she said. 'He's a man in 1,000. He's not ashamed of an old woman, and he holds that her soul is worth saving as well as richer people's. She said I was to give you this.' It was a small folded piece of paper, directed to him and sealed with a thimble. On opening it, he found it to be what she called her will, in which she left him her bureau, case clock, settle, 4-post bed, and frame sampler, in fact all the furniture of any account that she possessed. The curate went out like Peter at the cockcrow. He was a meek young man, and as he went his eyes were wet. When he reached a lonely place in the lane, he stood still thinking, and kneeling down in the dust of the road, rested his elbow in one hand and covered his face with the other. Thus he remained some minute or so, a black shape on the hot white of the sun trackway, till he rose, brushed the knees of his trousers, and walked on.